Na 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 na.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Sorry. My name is Rabbi Zachary Goodman. For those of you I've not had a chance to meet, want to welcome you to Holy Blossom Temple's presentation of the Israel Dialogues. Just wanted to wish you a quick welcome, a Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for being here. Thank you to all of our expert panelists, and thank you to our guests who we will be introducing to you shortly. Also, a thank you to our sponsor for today's program, Joni Stossel. Thank you for your generous gift of support. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor David DeWitt, one of our lead organizers for this webinar series. And David is going to introduce us and take us from here. Welcome.
Thanks, Rabbi, and welcome to everyone who's joined us for this first of the initial 8 sessions of Israel Dialogues. Just a moment to explain the background. The names that you'll be introduced to during this first session are a group of friends and colleagues who have come together over the last year and a half or so, perhaps partially because COVID forced us into a strong desire to have ongoing communication and exchange of views about serious things, but also because each of us in our own way has been very closely tied to Israel, to Canada, Israel, to the Jewish diaspora, and to the hope for peace amongst all peoples, and in particular peace in Israel and between Israel and the Palestinians. In May of this year, you will recall that there was a conflict that exploded between the Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza, and also related to what was going on in Sheikh Jarrah and Jerusalem. This prompted the group of us to realize that we had some things to talk about and things to exchange. And in our conversation with rabbis at Holy Blossom, agreed that this might be something that the community would enjoy participating in. And so at that time, we convened 3 sessions in May to talk about the issues of concern linking us with Israel and linking us with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was at that time brewing and exploding, unfortunately. Following that, we thought about something in the longer term, how we as individuals who pay attention to issues related to Israel might make a contribution to the larger dialogue within our community. And out of that and conversations amongst all of us and rabbis at Holy Blossom came the Israel Dialogues. The Israel Dialogues is meant to provide opportunities for conversation, to hear from experts, and to engage the audience. We will be running 8 sessions this fall, focusing really on domestic Israel, Jewish Israel, the Jewish diaspora, and the challenges faced and the factors relevant. And in the winter, we hope to offer another 8 series looking at regional and international contexts of issues that challenge Israel. So let me, for today now, invite my colleagues, Howard Edelman, John Allen, Derek Penzler, Mark Anshin, to open up their videos and join us. And Les Rothschild, who, as you know, has been very active in Holy Blossom and in ARTSA and the Canadian Zionist Federation, is joining us as well. And I'll let Howard, who is leading the first session on refugees, introduce our guest. Adi Schwartz, so I'd invite Adi to join us as well. And let me turn the microphone over to Howard.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll start by introducing Adi, but in fact, our conversation won't start for about 5 minutes or so, because I want to introduce the subject. But Adi is the co-author of a work called The War of Return. It's a book excellently written with him and Einat Wilf. And you can even see an interview, an hour-long interview with Einat and Adi on the book on YouTube. It's well worth reading. It's very readable. The translation from Hebrew is excellent. And it deals with the idea of right of return and UNRWA. And I'll get to that issue very shortly. But first, I want to introduce why refugees is the first of these sessions. Israel is a country formed largely by refugees, Jewish refugees who came and Palestinian refugees who fled. And it's a combination that's led to what is Israel today. Rabbi Zachary Goodman will post a chart of the population demography development of Israel. And if you look at that chart, you'll see the movement from Israel, or Palestine as it was then called, with very few Jews and very few others actually, to a country with almost 10 million people. But the key parts of it that we're tending to is, if you look at the influxes, they come from a mixture of refugees and ideology at first, then much more ideological, but then the real movement in 36, which takes it from 17.5% Jews to almost 30%, is of German refugees after the rise of Hitler. The key turning point, of course, is in 1947-48 with the war, in which the Jewish population jumps from 32% to almost 90%. And that's because partly, and mostly partly, because of the 720,000 Palestinian refugees who leave. Now, one of the things that I suggest about this conflict is that it's somewhat of an interfamilial conflict, because if you look at the genetic makeup of Jews, they're closer in makeup to the Palestinians than they are to Europeans, as the Ashkenazi Jews. And therefore, they're kind of second cousins. I mean, the Druzim and the Samaritans are first cousins, but they're kind of second cousins. So there's in one sense, a very much a family conflict. Now, a key part of this, and a central part, is the right of Jews to establish their own country and self-determination. And it's a right that's denied in current dominant Palestinian ideology. And as you'll hear from Adi Schwartz, has been dominated through the whole history of the movement. Now, what I want to do is start by introducing the issue of refugees by making a distinction. In 1949, when the United Nations Refugee Relief and Works Agency was established, it was called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. Then Palestine refugees meant both the Palestinian refugees who fled for various reasons, the 720,000, and Jewish Palestine refugees, about there were about 37,000 which were ethnically cleansed from what was immediately made part of Jordan when Jordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem. With that bit of introduction, let me bring on Adi and ask him first for an introduction to his book, and then I have an opening question for him.
Thank you very much for having me and for your interest in the book and in the subject. Well, my interest, and together with my co-author Einat, in the subject of refugees started because of our interest in the conflict. We live here, and both of us during the 80s and the 90s supported several peace proposals, also actually in the first decade of this century, of the 21st century. And as we all know, repeatedly, these peace proposals didn't work. They were rejected. And when we looked at them, they were supposedly exactly what the Palestinians wanted. For years, we have been listening and hearing that the Palestinians supposedly want to have their own independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as the capital. And when both Ehud Barak and later on Clinton and then Ehud Olmert in 2008 come up with these proposals, they are rejected and no peace is reached. And I think that, of course, this is a process. This is not something that happened in one day. We started asking ourselves, so wait a minute, if this is not what they want, what do they want? And we started really, it's not started, again, it's a process, but we noticed that there was a subject which was all the time there. Israelis, I think, in what's been called the peace camp, and perhaps the international community or the peacemakers or the peace industry, whatever you want to call them, didn't really focus on them. And I know, Howard, that you have some a different perspective regarding the role of Canada, but generally speaking, the issue of refugees didn't get the attention that it should have. And when we started researching and understanding what does refugees or what this issue means for the Palestinians, what do they mean when they talk about the right of return, the understanding or the common wisdom of everybody on the, again, on the peace industry was that this is some kind of a bargaining chip. Of course, the Palestinians understand that they can't possibly, 5 or 6 million Palestinians will never have the opportunity to resettle in Israel. But slowly, bit by bit, we understood that actually this is exactly what they mean. The Palestinians are adamant, at least, about the recognition of a right of return. So the book tries to analyze and to tell, it's a political history, it's a narrative, historical narrative of the origins of the problem from 1948. It's different perspectives or how it evolved. Of course, with an emphasis on the role of UNRWA, issues of the right of return, the several peace proposals and why they were denied, or sorry, rejected. And at the end, we're trying to give some kind of advices or some kind of plan for policymakers how to go forward. Because our goal is, even if not tomorrow or next week, is to sometime put an end to this conflict. And the perpetuation of the refugee issue is certainly not helping solving the issue, but the contrary, only to perpetuate it. So this is in a nutshell, the issue, the reason why we wrote the book, and its contents.
In your book, if I recall, you don't make a distinction of Palestinian refugees who are both Jews and Palestinians. And if so, if you didn't do that, why did you choose not to do so?
Well, one thing that became very much clear to us during the research is that more than anything else, the refugee problem is a political problem. It is sometimes disguised as a legal problem. as a humanitarian problem, but in fact, it's a political problem reflecting exactly what you said in your introductory remarks, the refusal of the Palestinians to recognize and to reconcile with the notion of a Jewish homeland or a Jewish sovereignty in their ancestral lands, in the Jewish ancestral lands. So again, you're right. In the beginning, there were a few tens of thousands of refugees, of Jewish refugees, because as you mentioned, the agency is not an agency for Palestinian refugees, but for Palestine refugees. But back in 1952, the Israeli government has decided that there is no need whatsoever for UNRWA to be responsible for these people. These people who had to flee, for example, the old quarter, the old Jewish quarter in Jerusalem and other areas that were conquered by Jordan and Egypt, all of them were naturalized. Of course, they got Israeli citizenship. There was no point in holding them or recognizing them as refugees. They were not refugees under any normal standard, international standard at the time. They were Israeli citizens. Of course, they needed solutions such as housing or, but in fact, at that time, beginning of the 50s, everybody in Israel were either immigrants or refugees from somewhere. And this goes to show the political nature of the problem. The Kingdom of Jordan in 1950, which is exactly at the same time, granted citizenship to all the Palestinians who were either in the West Bank or in the East Bank. But they didn't stop being refugees according to UNRWA. So in fact, your question highlights the different way, or again, the use of the refugees issue as a political tool, while Israel didn't want, they didn't want to settle any old accounts. That's it. The war ended. These people are in our country. That's it. They are citizens and, they continue their lives. Whereas on the Arab side, what happened is, even though in Jordan, it's not true for Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, but the Kingdom of Jordan gave all Palestinians, all refugees, new citizenship. That's the perfect, that's in all other cases in the world, that should have been the end of story. That's it. You are granted a new citizenship, you begin a new life, etc. But for those refugees, this was not the issue. They had no intention to put the question of Palestine or the state of Israel to rest. They continued to dream about this return, that one day they will go back to those lands and those areas that they left. So the issue of having new citizenship did not bother them to continue and being recognized as refugees by UNRWA. So this is an anomaly that can only be understood and explained by the political nature of the issue and not by issues of needs or humanitarian situation or legal situation.
Well, your stress on the politics of it is also stress on why they leave, because I described the leaving of the Jews from Jordan, from East Jerusalem and from the West Bank as ethnic cleansing. If you read the Palestinian literature, it's very rarely referred to, and for any reason, whatever reason they give. But I give the definition of ethnic cleansing. On the other hand, they clearly characterize the exodus of Palestinians as ethnic cleansing. Now, your book doesn't do that, and could you expand on that?
Well, I think that our position, after having read, so many documentation and interpretations, is that this is how a war looks like. Now, we are now talking in 2021, and international standards, at least officially, have changed. But back in the 40s, this is a very normal, so to speak, way of how wars were conducted. If you look at the 40s, and I'm not talking about World War II, I'm talking about, for example, the way the Indian subcontinent has been divided to India and Pakistan. If you look at Germany and Czechoslovakia after the war, all these cases, when war broke out, when it ended, populations moved and didn't go back. So I think that personally, I mean, of course, I agree that there is a difference between the two situations if you look at the facts. The fact is that at the end of the war, when the borders, or at least the ceasefire, the armistice agreements were signed, there was no Jew left in any Arab territory. So this is a very clear sign. If there's no one there, not in the Jordanian-controlled West Bank, not in the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip, et cetera, so of course it's an expulsion. If not even one Jew, was left, then of course it's a forced expulsion. That's not the case in Israel. In Israel, we had about 20%, between 15 and 20% of the population of the new state of Israel, as you just showed in your statistics, who were Arabs. So now that does not mean that in certain cases, and we all know the important work of Benny Morris and others, that does not mean that in certain cases, of course, there were expulsions. When war breaks out, and this was a very bloody war, it was a war from door to door. People think that perhaps they imagine that the Israeli army of 1948 is the Israeli army of 2021. And we have F-35s, and we have these huge, cyber technology, et cetera. On the contrary, the war of 1948 was a very, in our terms, very primitive war. They had very light guns and perhaps a little bit of armor and armored vehicles, etc. So when a village was conquered or when a village was cleaned, I mean, in terms of the ability to fight, then many times people, even innocent people, children, women, elderly people, were forced to flee. That's exactly how war looks like. For us, it was less important. I think that along the years, exactly as you said, the Palestinian narrative stressed very much the issue of how exactly the war was conducted. They wanted to create the image that the Israeli forces had done something which, by the way, as Arafat said and many other people, the Nakba is the worst tragedy on earth. These are real quotes. We do not believe that the actual facts of what happened in 1948 explain why we still have refugees in 2021. The Czech, I was quite astonished during the research to read how the Czechs expelled the Germans in 1946. This is 1946. This is not amidst the war. This is after Germany surrendered, more than a year afterwards. There were a few million ethnic German-speaking remaining in the new Republic of Czechoslovakia. Nobody went and asked them, excuse me, were you a Nazi? What exactly did you do in the war? Are you a peaceful citizen? No. I read the descriptions of German students being burnt alive in main squares in Prague, of thousands of Germans being put on trains. Some of them, by the way, were used earlier by the Germans to send Jews to the concentration camps. Horrific stories of people being beaten to death, kept in. So, this is how war happened in 1946. Not a war. This is how Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia. And you don't have German refugees today. So what I'm trying to say is that the circumstances, what actually happened, who shot whom, and when exactly, this is a very classic question. What exactly happened in Deir Yassin? What exactly happened in Tiberias? Okay, I agree. It's very important. It's very interesting, but it helps us nothing at all to understand why in 2021 we still have refugees. Nothing in the war of 1948 was special. If anything, it was a very mild war in terms of global, how wars were conducted at the time. And, you know, there are better people. I mean, I don't feel that I have anything to add to what Benny Morris has meticulously done for so many years. What I'm trying to say is that this does not explain why the problem is still with us. This is the reason why we didn't, you know, go so deep into the question of exactly ethnically cleansing, etc. But of course, you're right. Of course, you're right. The Jews were ethnically cleansed from all Arab territories, whereas Arabs remained in the new state of Israel. Of course, these are the facts.
Let's shift a bit to a vision solution and the issue of the right of return. Both you and I agree that the origins of the phrase right of return is due to Count Bernadotte. And you can read in the UN archives what he proposed as distinct from Resolution 194. Now I'm going to come to the question of why he proposed it, because on that we disagree. But before then, let's just make distinctions between what Resolution 194 provided for versus what Count Bernadotte proposed.
So there are a few very important distinctions, and just to put it on a historical scale, Count Bernadotte was the Swedish count, part of the royal family of Sweden, who was earlier during World War II involved in certain. He was I think the head of the Swedish Red Cross, or the deputy head. I'm not sure.
He was the head.
He was the head. Okay. And he had all kinds of humanitarian missions during the war. And in 1948, right after the establishment of the State of Israel, if I'm not mistaken, the day after, on May 15th, the Security Council of the United Nations decides to send a UN envoy to Israel, Palestine, or to the British Mandate, which just ended, to try to find a solution, ceasefire, peace agreement, whatever you want, and they choose Count Bernadotte. Now, the decision to send him was quite unnatural, you can say. He had no involvement whatsoever earlier in issues related to the Middle East. He had no knowledge or you know, background in the Middle East. He was simply sent from Sweden to Israel. Now, to your question, Bernadotte suggests one plan how to put an end to the war in June 1948, and then the more important suggestion is in September, and then exactly, 3 days later or at the same day, he is assassinated, and then in December, so 3 months later, the General Assembly of the United Nations votes on the resolution, which is 194, the famous resolution. So this is just about the timeline. The difference is, first of all, that Count Bernadotte, in his writings and in his suggestion, talks specifically and uses the term right of return. So Bernadotte is the first to use the term right of return, and this term does not appear in Resolution 194. Now, Resolution 194 is in fact very different than what most people think it is. Again, the whole purpose of the Bernadotte mission was not to find a solution to the refugee problem. It was meant to find a solution to the war between Israel and the Arab states. And Resolution 194 of December 1948 has 15 clauses. The purpose was to find a peaceful resolution to all problems between Israel and the Arab states. So, for example, there's a clause there, if I'm not mistaken, number 5, which says that Arab states and Israel must cooperate economically. And there's another clause that all disputes should be resolved in political terms, not in violent terms. So it's a kind of a first peace proposal or a peace mediation attempt between Israel and the Arabs. And then comes Article 11, which is the only one which the Palestinians mention. So they took the resolution 194, which is about 2 or 3 pages, and they're only interested in one clause. This is number 11, which is not exactly how Volker Bernadotte proposed it. So for example, the term right of return, the word right does not appear in resolution 194. Now this is extremely important because when you talk about a right, this is a legal term. A legal term puts it in the realm it's not a political issue anymore. If someone has a right, then he has a right. And that's in a time when you had all the discussions of universal rights of man, etc., the declaration in 1948. So this takes it out of the realm of politics, because if it's politics, then one side to negotiation says A, the other side says B, and you find some kind of a compromise. The fact that mainly Britain, the UK, and the US, who wrote the decision, who were responsible for the wording, did not mention specifically the word right of return, therefore means that they didn't see it as a right. What did they write, in fact, in the decision? They wrote that refugees who want to return should, I don't remember the exact words, should be allowed to return. Should be allowed to return. And then there are a few ifs. So for example, those who wish to live in peace. This is not an automatic right who's granted to anyone. According to resolution 194, only those who wish to live in peace. Now, I remind you that December 1948 is still in the midst of war. Armistice agreements, which put an end, at least for the time being, to the war, were signed only later during the year of 1949. And the resolution also mentions other solutions, such as compensation to the refugees. Now, above all, this is a very post-mortem discussion. No one in 1948 thought that by saying that the refugees who wish to return should be allowed to return, nobody thought that this should be some kind of a legal infrastructure for the Palestinians to come 73 years later and say, well, we have a right because 194. First of all, legally, strictly legally speaking, Security General resolutions such as 194 are non-binding. As you know, if anything, the Security Council is allowed to, or let's say in international law, Security Council resolutions are much more important. In the Charter of the United Nations, it is said explicitly that United Nations General Assembly resolutions are unbinding, non-binding. So you can't say, I have a right. It doesn't even say that you have a right, but you can't say, I have a right of return because resolution 194. It has no meaning whatsoever. Unfortunately, in the 77 years since the establishment of the United Nations, we have so many General Assembly resolutions which nobody thinks seriously should be part of international law. So this is the most important thing to remember. Resolution 194 is irrelevant in terms of international law. That's one. Second of all, Resolution 194 is a whole resolution. You can't say that you have a right of return. I mean, let's talk, for example, Arab states in the 50s. They all voted against it. When Resolution 194 came to the General Assembly to vote in favor of that resolution, all Arab states who were already members of the United Nations, so for example, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, all of them voted against it. Why? Because the whole idea of 194 was to find a peaceful resolution and to recognize the state of Israel. So what did the Arab states do? They said, no, we vote against. Why? Because we are not willing to recognize the state of Israel, but we think that the Article 11 gives us a right of return. So they totally misrepresented the notion. Abba Ibn said that this is an extravagant way to read the resolution. So you understand, it's not, again, this is not about how to read General Assembly resolutions. It's about using the refugee problem as a political tool to undo the state of Israel. Now, one last remark before you continue, you have to remember that right after 1940, I mean, when the armistice agreements were signed, what could the Arab states say against the state of Israel in terms of international standing? What could they say? So, you know, nowadays, there's a whole issue after the Six-Day War, there's a whole issue of the occupied territories, right? There's the West Bank, there's Gaza, there was the Sinai, there's the Golan Heights, etc. There's something to talk about, there are settlements. But prior to the Six-Day War, there were no such issues. The only open, quote unquote, issue was the issue of refugees. So this became a tool, a political tool to attack the state of Israel. Again, all other refugees from the 40s, Poles, Ukrainians, Czechs, Germans, Italians, Austrians, you know the history of post-World II, Indians, Pakistanis, right? None of them is refugee. None of them are refugees today. So the only reason why the Palestinians are refugees today is because their political goal has not been achieved.
Howard, let me just intervene for 1 second. I should have informed the audience, if you have any questions or comments, to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Howard will track that so that shortly in the discussion, we can pick up your questions and try and address them. So it's the Q&A function at the bottom right of your screen for most of you. Thank you. Sorry, Howard, back to you.
No, not at all. Thank you for reminding people. Let's go back to this political issue, because in my reading of the archives of the UN, virtually everybody was opposed, not only the Arab states, were opposed to Bernadotte's proposal because they thought of the primacy of sovereignty. A second reason, which you don't mention in your book, is the rationale. You argue, I think it's realpolitik that motivated Bernadotte. My reading was that Bernadotte had a crazy ideology that your personality and your political health and everything depended on you remaining in the roots where you were born and growing up there. And therefore, these people were suffering in a terrible way because they were deprived of their roots. On the other hand, Jews weren't rooted in the Palestine. He doesn't, as you know, he didn't believe in a Jewish state in the Middle East. He thought it was a big mistake. So there was a whole contention against Bernadotte. Now the question then arises, why does it become a big political thing to hang your hat on, even though the Arab states went against it? I have a difference here with you again, because I think that initially it wasn't a tool of politics. The tool of politics were, they were going to go back with an army, they were going to conquer Israel, and the Palestinians would return, not because they were right, but because of power. As it wasn't going to happen, as it became real that wasn't going to happen, then much later, 10 years later, and with Davis taking head of UNRWA, the right of return becomes preeminent. Now, so that's a slightly different narrative than yours, and I wonder if you could comment on it.
Okay, so first of all, regarding Bernadotte, perhaps, I mean, first of all, you know, for any historical event, many explanations can be valid at the same time. Since Bernadotte was assassinated, he didn't leave, of course, we don't have a lot of documentation after his death. We have his book. that he wrote, My Mission to Jerusalem, or The Way to Jerusalem. I don't remember how it's called in English, which I read. It's a very interesting book. And I'll tell you why, my impression of Bernadotte, how I came to think of it. First of all, okay, let's say, I mean, what you said is very natural. I mean, of course, people who were born, let's say, in Munich, want to stay in Munich. That's very natural. In normal terms, of course, that an Arab who was born in Haifa or in Jaffa or whatever, of course he wants to stay there. That's perfectly normal. But my question is, and I'm quite sure that Bernadotte was aware of that, is that he didn't live in a vacuum. He lived in a global environment where just 1 year earlier, when the Soviet Union decides to move the Polish border a few dozen kilometers or more to the west, right, at the end of World War II, and by that forcing millions of people, Poles have to move from the Ukraine to Poland, Ukrainian. Now, all of them were living there for tens of years, perhaps hundreds of years. Why the distinction? Why did the Palestinians, I mean, why Bernadotte was so concerned about the natural environment of a person in Jaffa, but nobody cared when Poles and Ukrainians and Germans were ethnically cleansed? Czechoslovakia expels 3 million Germans. Now, these people to West Germany, these people have never put a foot in West Germany. They lived in Czechoslovakia, in the Sudeten area, for hundreds of years. This was their ancestral land. 3 million people after the war. Why no? And this is 1946, so this is 2 years, and I'm sure Bernadotte was aware. My question is not why, so I'm just posing the question now. I ask myself, what was different in the case of the Palestinians? And when reading the book, I came to a few conclusions. One, as you say, a priori, Bernadotte writes, even before he arrives to Jerusalem or to Tel Aviv, I thought partition was a bad idea, as you just mentioned. I don't think a Jewish state is a good idea. Now, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, if this is the mediator between the Jews and the Arabs, the Jews in 1948, for about 50 or 60 years, depending on when you start counting, say morning, day and night, that they are interested in a homeland, in a political entity, in sovereignty in the land of Israel. Now, for the mediator to come and say, well, you know what? I don't think it's a good idea. So for me, it's a very clear indication that we have here someone which is far from being neutral. This was the heart of the matter, the creation of the state of Israel. And the mediator comes from nowhere and says, well, I was in the, he favored the minority report, right? The position which said basically that this should be some kind of, the Jews should have some kind of an autonomy under the Jordanian kingdom. This was the minority report of the United Nations. So for me, it's very indicative to all his positions. Now, I'll tell you something more. I read his positions and the way he portrayed it. This is his diary. The book is his diary from his many encounters in the Middle East. So he goes to Cairo and he flies. He has this very nice villa in the island of Rhodes, and he flies to Cairo. He's meeting there the Egyptian dignitaries and the Arab League. Now they all come with the same, mantras again and again. We will never recognize a Jewish state. We will never recognize a Jewish state, right? Again and again and again. Now, he doesn't tell them, listen, guys, this is very nice that you will never recognize, but right now, under international law or under international norms, we have the partition plan, right? Most of the states on earth are in favor of that. Let's try to negotiate. Perhaps you can come to terms with this new reality. He does no such thing. He goes out of the room and he tells his deputy, Ralph Bunch, which afterwards becomes his successor. He writes in his diary, oh, I'm so happy, I'm so glad that the Arab leaders are still willing to talk to me. So he doesn't even try to do something which is the core demand of the Jews. How is he a mediator if he is not even addressing the core issue, which is the existence of the state of Israel? Okay, so then he flies to Tel Aviv, meeting with David Ben-Gurion, but most often with Moshe Sharet, at that time already the foreign minister. And the way he talks to the foreign minister is very different. When Moshe Sharet tells him, listen, we are not going to take in hundreds of thousands of people who just fought against us. We're in the midst of war. This is suicide. This is a suicidal act. We will not accept refugees into the state of Israel. So you know what he answers? He tells them, and this is 3 years, only 3 years after the end of World War II, he tells him that if Jews want to have good reputation in the eyes of the world, again, only 3 years after the extermination of millions of Jews, so the Jews need to do something to win over international community. He tells him, if you want to gain the respect of the international community, you should at least accept some Arab refugees. So when I put all this together, and by the way, there's also all kinds of comments by his secretary saying that they much prefer the atmosphere in Cairo than in Tel Aviv. That there was a general dislike of these. There's a feeling of a nuisance. The new state of Israel is a nuisance. It was much better. We could have solved the issues. When I say we, I'm talking about Western countries, mainly the UK, with the very important strategic interest in the Middle East. That was the reason why they fought so, fiercely for the Negev, which was supposed to connect between Egypt and Jordan. We can go on with these strategic. I just read parts of the diary of Ernest Bevin in 1948. The whole notion of creating the state of Israel was such a pain in the neck for him. It was such a nuisance. So you understand that this is the atmosphere. I think that this is the difference between our conflict and other conflicts in the world. The notion that you can press the Jews a lot and accept the demands of the Arabs. Now, I'm not saying that part of it wasn't, as you said, he had this perhaps romantic or generally ideology that means that people should remain where they are. I mean, that's perfectly fine. I agree, by the way. I don't think that, there should be wars, etc. But I'm just asking myself, why is this the only conflict where this romantic ideology came to the surface? This is the question that I'm asking.
Okay, related to that question, and this is my last question. We'll get our other experts involved in asking you questions. It brings it right up to date, and the use of the right of return today. And I'll just hold you up Terry Rempel's book. It's very thick. It's on refugee rights and as a principle, and it's a result of a conference, and it's the Battle Resource Center, which is the main Palestinian accumulation of data on the refugees. And I'd say one major thesis of the book is it's all right for self-determination to take place, but it's not right for Jewish self-determination. Now, there's a lot of contention, and we'll have a future session on this, that's an anti-Semitic statement. It's not only anti-Zionist, but it's anti-Semitic because you're denying Jews a right to self-determination, which you grant to every other ethnic group. And the question is why? If that is the central issue, then why focus on the refugees? Even though I argue, as you do, that it's a key issue in resolving the debate. But if it's about the right to self-determination, and the refugees are just an element to bring up that right, and how you interpret that right, why not give the emphasis to that?
Okay, so first of all, I agree with everything you said. why deal with the refugees? So I think that a few reasons. First of all, it's the most, let's say, evident or clear manifestation of the problem. Because when you discuss territory, or when you discuss how to divide Jerusalem, for example, or when you discuss security concerns, it's easy to draw on a map how to, it's not easy, I mean, as we have seen, but it's easier, let's say, to draw a line or a border between, two groups of people. And the problem of the refugees helps us unlock, it's like a key to enter the room of the more important issues. Because when you start talking about refugees, you start asking questions exactly like you said. Wait a second, Arab refugees, Jewish refugees, why are they still refugees? How does a refugee is even, what's the definition of refugee? So this is a way to start talking about the refugees and this is why I'm all the time I'm stressing the political dimension, because you can't understand the issue of refugees if you don't understand the Palestinian narrative. The problem of the refugees could have been solved 70 years ago if the Palestinians accepted, as you said, the notion of Jewish self-determination. If the Arab world, by the way, if the Arab world accepted the notion of Jewish self-determination, there was no war of independence. They would have accepted the partition plan, say, okay, you know what? The Jews have part of it, the Arabs have part of it. Okay, that's fine. Like people compromise. No, this is the reason. This is the main reason we still have a conflict. And I think the refugees is a main, the most important manifestation of it. Now, a few more reasons why to deal with the refugees. This is a problem which only gets worse each day because, and when we started working on the book, we had, I think, 5.3 million refugees. Right now, we have 5.7 million refugees. The numbers are growing. And at one point or another, someone will have to come to these people and tell them, listen, guys, you're not going anywhere. You're not returning anywhere. Many people in refugee camps, in Lebanon, certainly, in the Gaza Strip, certainly, in some parts of the West Bank, certainly, they are so convinced that someday they will return that I'm asking myself, when will the time come that the United States government, Canadian government, the European Union, the Arabs themselves will tell them, you're not going anywhere. You're not returning anywhere. That's it. Build your lives. I mean, just think of all the billions of dollars that the international community and the entire energy of the international community on the reconstruction of Gaza, right? Every time now again, we talk about the reconstruction of Gaza. Gaza will never be reconstructed until people will understand that they are staying there. The population of Gaza, 75% of them to this day are considered refugees by the United Nations. Imagine a piece of territory, which is by United Nations agency considered 75%, 3 out of every 4 Gazans has the impression that he is a refugee. What does it mean that he's a refugee? That his home, his permanent home, will one day be somewhere else. Of course, where would it be? In his mind, Beersheba, Ashkelon, whatever. What kind of an incentive he has to build a new life, right? Now, the international community endorses this idea. I don't think that the American administration or the British government really supports return. They don't, but they are too shy or too afraid of a backlash to come forward and say, no, that's it. You want to reconstruct Gaza? That's it. No more refugees. We're willing to pay, a lot of money, but not to build tunnels and not to shoot rockets. We can build hospitals, we can build schools, but look what's happening. Every cent, every dollar that is being put in Gaza doesn't go to hospitals and schools. It goes to tunnels and rockets because they have this inner feeling, very strong inner feeling that they are returning. Now, I'll say something more. I know it's not exactly to your question, but it's a little bit of a by association, we sometimes see in 2018, people of Gaza started doing these marches of return towards the border with Israel. Now, march of return. The people of Gaza are not shy. They are telling us exactly what they want. It's not called the March for Independence, the March for Better Lives, the March for against corruption. No, it was called the March of Return. Now they go towards the border, they meet a reporter of the New York Times, and the reporter of the New York Times asks them, and this is a video that was put on the front page of the New York Times, he asks them, excuse me, mister, why are you here today? What is the purpose of this demonstration? And he tells them, we want to reconquer our lost territories. You see there beyond the border, beyond the fence, this is our land. We will never, all these things. And then he says that in Arabic, right? In Arabic. And then the reporter of the New York Times turns towards the camera and tells us, the viewers, well, as you can see, people of Gaza are marching because they want, they protest against the siege. They want to have better conditions, etc., etc. So totally, falsifying what the person just said, explaining instead of him why. So what I'm trying to make the point is that for the people of Gaza, the issue of return is very real. People in the West think that this is some kind of a fantasy. They know that they're not returning. So coming again to your question, they really think they return. This is their way, as you say, to undo the injustice of 1948. Again, undoing the Jewish right for self-determination. And of course, these are two issues going hand in hand. Of course, this is part of the issue. Now, I do want to say something about the question of anti-Semitism. I think we have to be a little bit careful and to look at the motivation of people. Now, generally speaking, this is my understanding. The Arab world, okay, let me start somewhere else. Anti-Semitism.
Adi?
Yes.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Before you start, I just want to remind Howard, who's chairing this, that we have a list of questions on the Q&A. John Allen has his hand up to ask something. Other panelists might want to be involved.
Okay, I stop here. Okay.
We're now at 1 o'clock. We've extended the time so that for people who are available, both among the panelists as well as the audience, the Zoom you're on is good until 1:30. So Howard, I'll let you, I'll turn this back to you, but I just want to make sure that everyone knows that there are questions and questioners waiting, and we are at 1 o'clock, but we can stay on for some time still. Thanks.
Let me just hold up the title of the book to remind people have asked in the chat to see it. And then secondly, call on John to make some comments or questions.
Thank you. Just to say that Derek also has his hand up, so he'll perhaps follow me. Just a couple of things, Adi. Thank you very much, both of you, for that very, very interesting historically and very interesting for what I hope we'll get to, which is how do we move forward. A couple of things. I agree with you 100% that, and Canada as the gavel of the refugee working group certainly agreed that, ultimately we're talking about a recognition perhaps of the right, but only a small number of people would be able to return to sort of fulfill that, and then there would be compensation. Agreed. On the question of UNRWA, which I know you take a stand, irrespective of whether UNRWA is the representative of the refugees, my understanding from my time in Israel and speaking to people in the UN divisions in those days, and even now, I think in reality, is that Israel needs UNRWA. Because if Israel didn't have UNRWA to take care of education, health, social services in Gaza, Israel would have to take care of it, or some other UN agency would have to take care of it. So if you don't like the refugee part of UNRWA, you have to have somebody there to take care of the humanitarian situation. The second thing I would just say is when you say, why doesn't the US or Canada or the EU say to the Palestinians, there is no right of return? Why doesn't Canada, the US, and the EU say to the Israelis, stop the settlements? In other words, the Western world should not be taking sides, one or the other. They should be telling all sides what is needed and enforcing by their whatever way they can what they believe to be eliminating obstacles to peace. And I would only also say that you make the point that the Gazans are shouting for the right of return. Well, the settlers are shouting for a greater Israel, okay? And Israelis in general, I think, are shouting for Jerusalem to be all theirs and no East Jerusalem. So each side has their, what I would call extremists, in some cases they're not very extreme, arguing for their ultimate wishes in a settlement. And what we all need is compromise on both sides. So I think we just have to realize that Gazans aren't going to stop, and either will those arguing for a greater Israel. We need to move to the middle. Thank you.
Adi, just hold your response. I want to hear from Dylan first, and then
Derek.
somebody else, and then you'll respond generally. Dylan, where are you?
Derek, I think.
I think it's
Is it
Derek.
Derek?
Looking for it.
Oh, it's Derek who had his hand up.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Howard, and thank you, Adi. That was really interesting. I just have a question and a comment. The comment first, I don't think the comparisons work with anything else, because in the case of the Palestinians in the states that have been asked to receive them, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on, Jordan, they really forced on them. And the Palestinians were forced to leave, and the receiving states were forced to, as you would have liked, to accept them. In the case of India, Pakistan, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League both accepted the idea in principle of partition, although they hated how it was executed. It was done terribly. The Radcliffe line was drawn by someone who knew nothing about the region. It was done much too quickly and it was chaotic. But in principle, the rivals agreed on the concept. And in the case of post-war Germany, the occupied Germany and then the Federal Republic had very good reasons to accept what were called the Vertriebene, the Volksdeutsche, the ethnic Germans. And the ethnic Germans weren't thrilled about leaving, but in other words, in the case of Palestine and the Arab states, nobody wanted this. The Palestinians are forced to leave, the Arab states are being compelled to accept them. So I don't think the comparisons work. My question is this, and it really goes to both Howard and to Adi, which is about the concept of the historical evolution of right. And the fact is that what we consider to be a right today was not considered to be a right in the past. You know, we talk about reproductive rights. That wasn't a right 200 years ago. As opposed to the right of return, I mean, in the 1970s, there was a human rights revolution in the world. The whole concept of human rights was transformed. And when Palestinians start talking about the right of return in the 1970s and the Palestinian movement rises to prominence worldwide, it's just a different situation. So talking about 1945, 46 is fine from a historical point of view, and you're right, but it doesn't really help very much because the language of right changes so much in the last half century. And we're in a different space today than we were after World War II.
Adi, do you want to comment on the two questions and comments?
Yes, of course. I can talk for hours only about these questions, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. Okay, let me start with Derek, okay, because it's more fresh in my mind. You're absolutely right that notions of what consists human rights, right? This whole notion of human rights, the notion has expanded. And when we talk today about human rights, it's different than what we thought in the 40s. But my question is this. Let's say that you recognize a universal right of return. Let's say that we recognize that each person on earth has a right to return to his ancestral, or where he lived, or where he was born. Not only in the case of Israel and Palestine. Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue? By the way, the question of Germans that you mentioned was only, I'm quite sure, by the way, that some Germans would like to go to Poland. Do you think that Poland will let them? I'm quite sure that many people in Africa would want to go back, people from Burma to Thailand. Perhaps people from the United States would like to go to all kinds of places. People from the Baltics would like to go to Russia and vice versa. Could you imagine the chaos that would ensue? So what I'm saying is that, again, if this is the new norm of the international community, that each one has the right. By the way, my parents were born in Romania. Okay? They had to flee Romania in the 60s. Their citizenship was stripped. Can they go back today? Can they go back and have their citizenship and their property? No. Do you suggest, I mean, I would go with you. Let's give the Palestinians a right of return, a legal right of return, only if it's a universal right and you give each person on earth the right to pursue a right of return. You understand that this is not going to happen, right? So I'm asking myself if it should happen only in the place where it could actually destroy a state, right? Because 5 or 6 million Palestinians will actually make this state into an Arab state. So this is just a very, you know, a general thought. Now, I remember if I have something more to say, but John, you said that why doesn't Canada tell the, so I was asking why does Canada, I mean, why Canada doesn't tell the Palestinians, listen guys, there's no right of return, and then you say, well, they don't tell the Israelis that no settlements. I don't know, I'm 47 years old, and I can tell you that almost every day I hear in the news that either the EU or the American administration, Canada perhaps is not very vocal on this, but the Swedish are very vocal, and each European country comes to the state of Israel and say, you must stop settlement activity. Now, let me tell you even more than that. In 2016, the Security Council of the United Nations voted in favor. As you remember, the United States decided to abstain, and they decided that the settlements are illegal under international law. Now, my colleague Einat Wilf and I published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal following that decision and said, you know what, guys, okay, fair enough. You have this vision of a two-state solution, which, as I told you, both of us supported all the suggestions that were on the table. But if you want to be fair and coherent with your own policy, now put forward a decision saying that there are no more refugees, dismantle UNRWA, and tell the Palestinians that there's no right of return. I would be very satisfied if the Palestinians got the same message that the Israeli government receives about the settlements. No one in Israel thinks that the international community likes the settlement. Believe me, everybody in Israel knows that every building in East Jerusalem or whatever you want is against the will of international community. No one in the Gaza Strip knows that the right of return is inconsistent with their policies. Now, this brings me to your what you said about, okay, that's it. I mean, these people of Gaza want to return. What do you want? Some Israelis want the greater Israel. Okay, that's fine. We wrote this book in English. By the way, there's a version going to be published in Arabic soon. But this book is being published in English because we want to influence the international community. I don't have any illusions that me, Adi Schwartz, or Einat Wilf will come to the Palestinians and tell them, listen, guys, you're not refugees, it's over. I don't have any illusions, but I do hope, and I do think actually, that the international community has enough leverage in terms of money, in terms of diplomatic pressure, to put pressure on the Palestinians, just as they put pressure on Israel to stop settlement activity, to stop this idea of refugees. And this is, again, the reason, as you said, Howard, in the beginning, why do we deal with refugees in UNRWA? Because this is a point of leverage. This is somewhere that you can actually say, listen, guys, we're not going to fund this anymore. Now you say, okay, but someone has to take care of them. Perfectly fine. I don't have any problem. My only problem is the political dimension of being recognized as refugees. So for example, UNICEF or USAID or UNESCO or whatever other organization, or the PA or the government of Syria or the government of Jordan, why do we have refugees and UNRWA working in Jordan? The government of Jordan can't take care of them? Can't they give them, as you say, those social services of clinics and why do we need UNRWA in Jordan? Only politics. Because we know that the Jordanian king will be undermined if millions of Palestinians will get the message that they're not returning. Do you see how upside down this whole structure is? Now, the only thing I'm asking from the international community is not to be pro-Israel. The only thing I'm asking them is to be coherent with their foreign policy. If the foreign policy of most of the international community, and as far as I know, this is the case, both the EU and the United States, is to create a separation, political separation into two states, okay? One of them should be Arab, okay, a Palestinian state, but one of them should be Jewish. And if that state is going to remain Jewish, then the whole notion of refugee return should be taken out of the table. Now, I even give you another example. I know we're short on time, so this will be my last example. Take, for example, the government of Sweden. The government of Sweden has recognized the state of Palestine, okay? So if you recognize the state of Palestine, it means that everybody which is inside the state of Palestine is not a stateless person anymore. He's not a refugee. He is in Palestine. So at that moment, they should have stopped their funding of UNRWA, right? You can't recognize the state of Palestine and continue funding UNRWA. Something here doesn't add up. Something here is simply not to antagonize Palestinians or Arab states. By the way, exactly as Bernadotte did. This is the importance of Bernadotte. The fear that if we tell them the truth, then I don't know what will happen. But this only pushes peace further away from us. If ever peace is going to happen here, this will be only when the Palestinians and the Arab world get the clear message that Israel is here to stay. Israel is here to stay as a Jewish state. And if that is the case, then all kinds of resettlement should be happening only in Palestinian territories. By the way, just as the message is being very clearly and loudly sent to the Israeli government that, as you say, the dream of greater Israel is unrealistic. And yes.
I want to turn to David, because the international diplomacy is one of David's areas of expertise. David, essentially the proposal is that the Palestinians and the Israelis exist in silos that don't talk to one another. That his book is really addressed to the international community. And so indirectly, through pressure of the international community, then you'll get a change in the peace process. That's the thesis. Can you comment on that thesis as a method of advancing the peace process?
I wish I had brilliant insight. I should actually turn to John, who's the one who's had a career as an international diplomat. But I would say, much to my surprise, that what we're currently referring to as the Abraham Accords, if it is sustainable and broadens its reach and it's the participation of other states in the Middle East, it could create the kind of legitimate political and identity context in which Palestinians, who were able to gain recognition and support from Arab states would see an opportunity, and that Israel, in terms of its deepening relations with the Arab states, would feel the confidence that a sovereign Palestinian entity, state, could well emerge. I could see that. I know it's wishful thinking from the perspective of someone who believes in a two-state solution as the only appropriate response, outcome, and from someone who simply does not agree with a one-state solution from either perspective, which I think is extremist on either side. And if it's secularist, I don't think it's realistic. So yes, I think there's an important role to play, the international community, but unlike the international community of the last 50 years, the most important actors would be the regional actors and not the United States or the European Union or the Russians and now the Chinese, though they would have to be supported. They couldn't be spoilers. They would have to provide resources, but I think the motivation and the political integrity would have to come from the consolidation of something like what we're now seeing emerge under the rubric of the Abraham Accords.
John, let me bring you into this discussion again, but on a different aspect of this diplomacy issue. Adi's, one of Adi's themes is to say, you got to be straight, tell them the truth, here's the score. In their book, they talk about the fault of international diplomacy playing with what they called constructive diplomacy. And what I was taught by the Canadian diplomats was creative diplomacy. That's the use of equivocation to have both sides agree, even though they disagree, because they use the same terminology. And that was a big debate over in the multilateral talks over refugees and return. Can you comment on the role of international diplomacy, telling it as it is, as a method of moving towards peace?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that telling it like it is to the Palestinians on the right of return is inserting yourself into deciding the final status issues. Criticizing Israel for settlements, which is something that is illegal, has nothing to do with the final status issues. Okay, so we're operating on two different levels. I think it's dangerous, in a sense, for the international community to begin pronouncing on the final status issues. Those are to be negotiated between the parties. Now, it doesn't mean that Canada shouldn't be sitting down with the Palestinians and explaining to them why a full right of return is never going to happen, and it's not going to be a part of any solution to the problem. I fully agree that that's there, but for countries to make statements about the borders, the final status of refugees or Jerusalem, or security for Israel, for example, is not helpful. Those are issues that are to be negotiated. We can facilitate by sitting down and trying to explain why Israel must be secure and what they need for that security. And we can try and explain why any settlement that doesn't include East Jerusalem as a capital, but we can't make pronouncements, public pronouncements on those final status issues, I don't think helpfully. And I think the right of return is one of them. I think I have an opinion. I'm sure that the Canadian government and the Europeans and others have an opinion, and they can certainly tell the Palestinians what they think is reasonable. but it's not for us in some senses to insert ourselves in those final negotiations, except as facilitators. And I think, you know, if the United States was a real honest broker, they could try and do that, but so far they're not.
Mark, can I bring you in here? Because
Can I just have
go ahead.
this? So, John, I think that what you're saying doesn't describe what actually happens in reality, because the international community took some of the final issues, some of the core issues, for example, the status of Jerusalem. If indeed the international community wanted to not being involved or not pronounce their position on Jerusalem, they should have stayed out at all and not say anything about Jerusalem. Now, most countries that I know consider East Jerusalem as an occupied Palestinian territory. This is already, this designation, and by the way, opening consulates, which means that you recognize that as should be under Palestinian sovereignty, is interference in a final status issue. Another final status issue the international community has indeed intervened is the issue of borders. The West Bank is a contested area. It's a final issue area. It's a final issue. It should have been one of the final issues. If the international community would be true to your definition, they would not be involved. The entire issue of settlements should not have even been discussed. Let the parties decide. Perhaps Israel and the PLO or the Palestinians would decide on a smaller Palestinian state. What do you care? Why do you care that Israel builds houses in East Jerusalem? Not you, of course. I mean, Canada or the Security Council. Because most of the international community has indeed decided on a few core issues, their position. Everybody knows that the international community wants East Jerusalem to be the capital of the Palestinian state, and the West Bank is an occupied Palestinian territory. This is how it is designated, OPT, in many documents. So the only
Adi, just let me respond briefly.
Okay.
What the international community does not want is for one or the other party to take steps that are obstacles to peace or are basically deciding the issue. We're not taking a position on East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. We don't want Israel to occupy the whole land and then make any final status negotiation impossible. By settling the West Bank, you are making a discussion of that impossible.
I'm not rejecting, the question is this: why do you fund an organization which raises each day the number of refugees, which shouldn't have been refugees considered at all and recognized? This is also interference in the conflict, and by the way, in a very negative way. So what you're doing by the continued financing of UNRWA, by the way, Canada was one of the countries which, if I'm not mistaken, for a period of time decided not to do it. So some people in the Foreign Ministry of Canada thought that indeed it's a detrimental issue. What I'm trying to say, I'm not criticizing the Canadian position on the settlements. I understand this is the policy. What I'm trying to say is that at the same token, you should have taken out the money of UNRWA. There should be no funding of UNRWA, because UNRWA, just as you say that enlarging settlements is against the policy or against the rationale of a two-state solution, exactly, now we have 5.6 million refugees, which are not refugees. If we have this discussion next year, there will be 6 million, 7 million. These are also people who someday, in the West Bank, you have, let's say, 500,000 settlers. Okay, let's say. You have 5 million refugees. This is 10 times more. These people actually think they're going to return somewhere. And the government of Canada pays to an agency which gives them a refugee card for every baby that is born in Jordan. Why? Why do you do this? This is detrimental to the peace process. Has no rationale whatsoever. This is my question, you understand?
Just I can comment briefly. Uh, they're not only not refugees in an international language, but they are really displaced people, because internally displaced means you move from one part of your homeland to another. And that's the majority of, by far, of the Palestinian refugees. So they're not refugees in the UNHCR sense at all. I was going to call on Mark. Do you want to make some comments, Mark?
I just wanted to make a brief comment about tipping points. It seems to me that to move forward on any of these issues, there needs to be some tipping points. And one of the examples I use is 1977, when Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem and visited, and that was a breakthrough. That was a tipping point. That brought about a peace treaty and diplomatic relations between Egypt and Israel. And all these other types of issues, I think we need tipping points. So I agree with Adi on many of the, if not most of the points he makes, that what we're really talking about is tipping points. The right of return of Palestinian refugees, in my view, should be dealt with as a tipping point, and that the international world, the international community, through the various countries, particularly the Western democracies, should come forward and say, this is an issue that needs to be put aside for the time being, because it's not going to be ever resolved that the Palestinians population are going to be allowed to or permitted to move into Israel proper inside the Green Line. The same thing with the recognition of Jerusalem. I've talked to a number of my colleagues on this call about this. I see no reason, for instance, why Canada, the United States, well, the United States has already done, but why Canada and other countries can't recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, with the understanding that where the boundary of that municipal city should be drawn is a matter for negotiation. As to whether or not East Jerusalem should be the capital of a Palestinian state, that should be left for negotiation between the parties. But there's no reason why we can't recognize Jerusalem as the capital, and that we can't move our embassy to at least West Jerusalem, which we know will never be compromised and given up. So that to me would be a tipping point as well, and would also take another issue off the table. Thank you.
Derek, can I come back to you and the principle that whether it's comparative or not to those other issues, because you can take other comparisons like Rwanda, you can take Bosnia, Herzegovina, that are taken up, but the core issue is of transference and population exchange, which were accepted at the time as a method of solving problems. You change populations and you got more homogeneous ethnic groupings, and that helped bring about peace. Isn't that a parallel with the 40s, even though there are differences, especially since most of the Palestinian population moved into areas that were majority Palestinian in the first place?
I'll answer very briefly because we have about a minute and a half. I mean, I wouldn't hold Rwanda as an example of anything we would want to replicate anywhere in the world. And if there were a Palestinian on this panel, and I really wish that there were, we would hear the perspective that the idea of population exchange was an idea dreamed up by Westerners at the time of the Greco-Turkish War, in which about 2 to 2.5 million people wound up forcibly leaving their homes in the midst of a conflict. And in general, certainly the Palestinian legal scholars whom I read find the idea of population exchange to be repugnant. It doesn't mean it wasn't practiced, it was. But the idea that it should be accepted in the 21st century as a model is just something that I think a lot of our colleagues would just not accept. So population exchange may have worked very well in 1923, but the question is, do we really accept it in 2021?
With that, let's wind up, and very much thank Adi for being our guest and everybody else for their participation. I think we touched on some of the questions.
Can I have just a very quick few sentences to sum it up?
Sure.
Is that okay? So just Derek, to your last point, you touched exactly on the point when you said that India and Pakistan basically agreed on the need to create two states. This is exactly the problem. The Palestinians and the Arab world did not agree to the creation of the state of Israel. This is the core issue. The refugees is a symptom of the disease, and the disease is indeed the refusal to recognize a Jewish state or the state of Israel. Now, as long as the international community at large wants to promote peace, I think the way to do it is to make the Arab world understand that this is the reality, rather than tell the Jews to stop having their own state. Thank you.
Rabbi Goodman, are you going to come in?
So thank you, Adi, and thank you to our expert panelists. We appreciate your time and your expertise. We were going to make this recording available, so if there are any parts that you'd like to rehear or revisit, I'll be sending an email shortly with a link to the recording. Thank you again to Joni Stossel for her gift of sponsorship, and of course, thank you to our promotional partners at ARTSA Canada, the Canadian Zionist Federation, ARTSA, and the Reformed Jewish Community of Canada. We look forward to joining you next week, same time, same link, same place, and we'll be talking about the future of the two-state solution. So, gentlemen, thank you for your time, and this is going to conclude our afternoon together. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.